Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for State Approving Agencies What's That? With our special guest, Dave Bellefuille. I'm Sarah Pell. I'm the MCMC manager for the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Just a little housekeeping. If you want to submit questions, please do so through the chat feature, and follow-up will be done as necessary throughout the presentation as well as at the end. And we have an archive of the webinar, and it will be available on the MEC website. We want to thank Lumina and Strata for sponsoring and giving us the financial background to do what we do, and we hope to continue this work for a long time coming. Just a brief overview. The mission of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit is to facilitate an interstate partnership of 13 states and to translate competencies acquired by veterans through military training and experiences toward college credentials. States exchange information and share best practices in the areas of articulation of credit, certification and licensure, communication, and data and technology. Our main goal is to assist student veterans with completing post-secondary education and the transition into civilian employment. MCMC has established the following 3 goals to support this main one. Assist states and post-secondary institutions in aiding military-connected students with critical life transitions from the military to post-secondary education and then from post-secondary education to civilian employment. Increase post-secondary education completion rates by creating models for the consistent, transparent, and effective awarding of credit for military training and experience that can be scaled regionally and nationally, thereby lowering the cost of education and reducing the time to completion. And to establish a strong network of support, communication, documentation, and data collection among institutions and organizations for the purpose of promoting shared interests and tracking the efficacy of efforts to enhance military-connected students' educational success. To do this work, we have 4 knowledge communities: articulation of academic credit, communication and outreach, data systems and technology, and licensure and certification. Today's guest moderator is Stephanie Johns-Heise, who is the Vice President of Instruction at Salina Area Technical College. Stephanie, I'll let you introduce today's presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, today we are very happy to have with us Dave Bellefuille, Director of Education Employment from the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. Thank you so much today, Dave, for joining us.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, and really looking forward to kind of getting into this topic, which I know has come up on a few different occasions. So this is just our title slide here, but as we're moving forward, just an introduction on myself. I am, as mentioned, the Director of Education and Employment for the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm originally from a small town kind of in central Minnesota. It's Brainerd, Minnesota. I served about 12 years, just about 12 years active duty in the Navy, and had an opportunity to live and study and work in Italy, and still have some really good connections in Europe. After I separated from the Navy, I was an ERISA consultant, and for those of you who may not know ERISA, it's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and that has to do with retirement plans. So if you're contributing to IRAs or 401ks, 403bs, SEP simples, any of that. So I was a consultant to financial organizations, trust companies, fiduciaries, insurance companies, and such. But in 2006, we really had an opportunity to assist our veterans here in Minnesota. So kind of on a chance and some legislation and a little bit of funding from the state, we created the Higher Education Veterans Program. And for those of you who have been part of MCMC, you've heard me kind of present on some of those topics. But today, of course, we're focusing on the state approving agency. So my 4 areas here within the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs is, of course, that Higher Education Veterans Program. I administer the Minnesota GI Bill. I have veteran employment initiatives here in Minnesota, and then most importantly on today's topic is, of course, our state approving agency here in Minnesota. So my intent today is really to cover these three areas because the SAA is so broad and it's really kind of state specific. So it's really a high level overview of all the SAA functions and describe how the SAA is mandated through United States Code 38, their business plans, contracts with the federal agency, how they're housed in different agencies kind of based on the state, and that they could potentially have a little different vision of how to accomplish those required tasks which are set forth in those contractual agreements between the state and the federal government. But there is really one common thread that brings all of the state approving agencies together, and that's their strong national association, which NASA's National Association for State Approving Agencies. They just had their recent winter conference last week in Washington, D.C., so some of the information, of course, provided in today's seminar will focus on some of those topics that they had there. And to understand that it's really important for you to contact your local SAA for further for further guidance. Simply because they will have the answers, of course, that pertain to their particular state. So as we go further in our presentation, I'll show you how to contact those folks, the websites that are pertinent to this, and I also have a slide for our state points of contact here. Our agenda today is that. We'll do a little SA 101. We'll talk about some legislation. Again, I want to go high level. I don't want to get too nitty-gritty on the hows, how they accomplish it, but it's more of what's required from SAAs, and again, how SAAs can help us in this particular initiative. Who are the SAA staff? Contracts and business plans. Their core functions, which really kind of mandate what their work is. I want to talk a little bit about a casework about apprenticeships and OJT and how we do it in Minnesota, but again, it's going to be specific to Minnesota and not necessarily all the states. We'll get into to NASA and kind of button it up with the locations, and then how SAA can help us as we're moving forward. So the goal of the state approving agency is really to safeguard and promote a quality education and training programs. So they're not approving institutions, they're approving those programs within the institutions, and that could be in an on-the-job training site, it could be at an IHL or Institute of Higher Learning, could be an NCD, non-college degree program, the flight programs, and that's kind of that second area, apprenticeships, any of those license and certification testing. And I like to use that statement that essentially wherever the GI Bill benefit is used, the SAA approved it, with kind of one small caveat. There are some programs that have to be approved by the federal VA if they're potentially federal OJT sites or through interstate trucking or some of those. But for the most part, if the GI Bill benefit is being used at an institution, a training facility, the SAA more than likely approved that particular program. And again, those tasks are completed through the 6 core functions: the program approval, compliance, technical assistance, liaison, and of course contract compliance with that agreement between the feds and the state. So now we'll get into the really fun stuff, get into 38 USC, and it's you will have these slides. I believe Sarah mentioned that they're out on the website, so if you need that particular link and want to go really look into the nitty-gritty of each of these particular provisions, you certainly may, but it's under 38 USC Code Part 3, Chapter 36, and subdivisions, all of those. So if you're familiar with the GI Bill, you'll hear individuals say, like Chapter 33, for example. Well, that's post 9/11 GI Bill. Or Chapter 30, for example, Montgomery GI Bill. Those chapters are all part of 38 USC. It just happens to be that the legislative directive for SAA falls under Chapter 36, Subpart 1 and Subpart 2. And then each of those particular provisions are kind of spelled out here. So 3670, self-explanatory. What's the scope of approvals? Designation 3671, I wanted to show you, I know there's a lot of language there, but each state then is required by their chief executive to designate a state department as the SAA. Here in Minnesota, it's the Veterans Affairs, Department of Veterans Affairs. There's our statute, and that relates to that. So each of your states would have a very similar statute that directs where they are housed within your state. 3672 discusses program approvals at Institutes of Higher Learning, non-college degree, OJT, apprenticeships license. 3673 is that particular provision talks about the coordination among other state agencies and federal agencies to assist in the role. So state approving agencies really kind of cover a lot of different areas, potentially departments of education, departments of labor and industry, Department of Veterans Affairs. So that's why they're housed in different agencies just depending on that particular state. And the VA recognizes the importance of that kind of cross-communication and that coordination. So that particular provision really addresses the coordination of activities among all of those state and federal partnerships. So further along the lines, again, these are state employees performing federal work. So there has to be a reimbursement in there somehow for the states. And 3674 addresses how each of those reimbursements and what's reimbursable and kind of goes from there. 3674A is that evaluations of the SAA that really are done kind of at the federal level, and a self-evaluation done by the state approving agencies themselves. And the main point of contact, when I say the federal VA, the main point of contact is the state's education liaison representative, and I'll refer to that person as an ELR. In Minnesota, they're housed in the Whipple building here, and the work that's completed, so those core functions that we're going to get into, so that work that's completed is essentially turned into those education liaison representatives, and then the assessments are done based on the contract compliance and, of course, the work that was completed. So that's where that evaluation really kind of comes into play. 3675, 6, and 7 are all kind of self-explanatory. It's how they approve the accredited courses or non-accredited or OJTs. And then the notice of approved courses, that specifically addresses that if an institution has a program or a course that is approved by SAA, that we have to provide notice to that institution that that course is approved. And very similarly, 3679, and this gets a little bit tricky because there are programs that are out there that maybe are approved and an individual is using their GI Bill benefits, but it's determined during that particular semester or that training time that we have to disapprove that course. So that lays out all of those kind of requirements, because keep in mind that that individual may be using their federal GI Bill, and SAA has to, for whatever reason, remove that program from the approval list. So that gets a little tricky, but again, it's all covered under 3679. Moving on to subchapter 2 now. So that was subchapter 1. There are an additional 24 provisions that provide guidance on all of that, and a couple of them that I want to just kind of highlight here is one of them is conflicting interests. So we are, of course, providing compliance audits to institutes of higher learning, so we typically can't have our SAA as faculty on one of those campuses that we're providing auditing on. So that's addressed in those provisions. The measurement of the courses is another one. So that's defined. That's a unit definition. So is it clock hour? Is it semester hour? What's full-time status for high school students, because high schools can be approved for GI Bill usage. Quarter time, full-time, any of that is really kind of addressed in that measurement of courses. Overpayments is another one that we see quite a bit, especially with the post-9/11 GI Bill, which came around in 2009. The VA makes direct payments on the recipient's behalf to institutes of higher learning, and sometimes those certifications maybe aren't done correctly, and it creates an overpayment either to the institution or to the recipient themselves. So those are all addressed in that particular area, and they're typically not caught until we do compliance. And so that could potentially fester for a number of semesters until SAA may come in and catch something that's maybe done incorrectly on the certification side. So overpayments are a big part of that as well. And then advertising, because as you could imagine, the VA gets a little particular in erroneous or deceptive or misleading practices of advertising using the GI Bill, and sure, come on out to Dave's Institute of Higher Learning here. We'll get you a quality education, and we approve for the GI Bill usage when really you're not. And so the VA really gets particular on that, and that's part of SAA's function as they're doing compliance with those institutions, is to look at, what's the advertising that those institutions are using as they're promoting their programs to veterans. So that's hopefully I didn't lose anybody in the real nitty-gritty part of it, but that's really the legislative directive on what mandates what the SAA is required to do. And again, just to reiterate, these individuals are typically state employees who are doing federal work in those core functions that we'll get to also during our presentation here. So who are the SAA? Again, state employees, and the work is in accordance with the agreement that is signed. Well, we'll talk a little bit about the agreement when we get there, but we do what's called an SS Standard Form 30 every year, which is a modification to the agreement annually. So that is all spelled out. They're technical administrative staff. So here in Minnesota, we have 3 SAA staff members who are doing the work, and then we have 1 administrative person who is really kind of compiling everything and doing all the behind-the-scenes work and gathering the mail, the catalogs that are coming in that we need to review, getting the stuff over to the education liaison representative in a timely fashion. So it's a very well-oiled machine when all of those components are working in your state and the communication is working back and forth between the state agency and the federal education liaison representative. They're housed throughout the nation: Veterans Affairs, Department of Ed, Department of Labor, and in our particular area here, I think our central region, all but Iowa and Nebraska, and Iowa and Nebraska are housed in Department of Ed, and then Michigan the SAA is housed in the Workforce Development. All other ones that we have in this area are with their State Department of Veterans Affairs. Reimbursements, so the feds, and that's spelled out within the statutes there, or the laws, and state agencies are reimbursed by the VA for the salaries, the fringe, the travel. All administrative functions are all reimbursed by the federal VA for all work that's completed, and that, of course, reimbursement comes back to the state agencies, and typically SAAs will turn that in, and the reimbursements are a couple of months later from the Fed VA, depending on how long it takes, of course, to process and that there aren't any errors and such. What's determined by the state agency are the position descriptions. So by state, the position descriptions will be different. Pay and benefits may be different by state for individuals who are doing exactly the same work. Kind of the hierarchy. So do you have a whole team, like some of them might have 6 or 7 or 8 state approving agency representatives, where they might have, you know, a director over it, and then supervisors and some administrative folks, and a whole you know, combination. So that hierarchy, a lot of that is kind of determined also with the feds, because, you know, the work has to dictate. We can't say in Minnesota, hey, we're going to have, you know, 15 SAA members, and the work doesn't dictate that. But that hierarchy is still determined by the state agency. Annual performance evaluations are all done by those state agencies, with the exception that the VA assesses the work completed. So there's a definite line in the sand there. Performance that's done with employees, however, how is the work performed as well? So they're again, line drawn in the sand on some of that.
Contract. Dave, this is Sarah.
Yes.
This is Sarah. On the previous slide, we had a related question. One of our participants said that we had our first VA remote compliance survey last summer, and they had to package and mail everything to the VA regional office. Will this be more common in the future, or will SAA office still be doing compliance surveys?
So I think I'm seeing the question on there. So a remote compliance survey, and they sent everything to the VA. So so there are compliance survey specialists that work for the VA, who are kind of assisting, if you will, because keep in mind, like in Minnesota, we have 260 organizations who are VA approved, and we have 3 staff members who have to do compliance, have to check the catalogs, have to approve the programs, and all of that work has to be done annually. So in Minnesota, we have some compliance survey specialists who are, again, VA individuals. So that question may be directed toward those compliance survey specialists, where they reached out to that particular organization, and the VA did the compliance, not the SAA. And that work gets really kind of dictated again by the education liaison representative on what work and who's doing what in each state. And I know there's still some input at a state level from SAAs, but I want to say that is directed to those compliance survey specialists, but a great question. So maybe the next survey that they have done might be by the SAA folks instead of the Fed VA. Hopefully that answered that particular question. So the 6 core functions that we're talking about: program approval, you've heard me say this, just keep beating that. We're reviewing, evaluating, approving the quality programs of education. That's the core of that. We want to ensure that these programs that are approved for GI Bill usage are providing the best education opportunities for our recipients, and also for the tax dollars who are essentially paying for this education. And we covered this, but it's in all of those particular areas where we are doing those approvals. Compliance, which was based on the question we had, on-site visits, typically on-site visits to approved institutions, and providing those compliance surveys. So typically we'll have work in advance. We'll ask those institutions to pull specific records, and we have the authority also to pull non-veteran records. And some folks say, well, why would you need a non-veteran record? It's to compare and ensure that those veterans that the non-veterans and the veterans are first paying the same amount in tuition. Also, that the veteran students and the non-veteran students all have exactly the same program requirements. And we have had instances out there where institutions will charge a higher rate for veterans, for example. And that's the goal of the SAAs, to ensure that this is not happening, or that veterans are required to take more courses in the program than somebody who's a non-veteran. So it really gets in depth on those compliance audits and ensuring that these institutions and training establishments are following all of those laws that we defined earlier in our presentation. Technical assistance. This, institutions could come up, ask questions on all aspects of the approval process or clarification, or if they have, and this is where we really, MCMC at the institution level, this is where we need to really embrace and engage the SAA. Are those technical questions on programs that we may be creating that are bridge programs or veteran-only programs, and I cringe, and any SAA that are on the line also cringed when I just said veteran-only programs, because there are rules with the number of percentage of students who have to be in a program that are non-veterans, just so we can compare what I already addressed earlier, cost of it and the actual program itself. So a lot of technical assistance, and this is really where we should engage our SAAs in our states. The other three core functions is outreach. Again, we're promoting the increased usage of GI Bill benefits. We want to ensure that the opportunities are there for our men and women to use their GI Bill in on-the-job training sites, in apprenticeship sites, in other institutes of higher learning that there could be an NCD, a cosmetology school out there, or a barbering school that may not be approved, but yet they have veterans who are attending there. Let's look at those programs and see if we can approve them so those men and women can use their benefit in those arenas. Liaison, as we touched on this on one of the federal provisions, there's the collaboration with governments, the veterans, educational entities, resolving issues, identifying the whole kind of gamut of liaison with all outside agencies, be it state, federal, with the veterans themselves. We typically will get individuals who are using their GI Bill at an institute of higher learning and receive a denial letter from the VA that says this program isn't approved. So we investigate why that program isn't approved. Maybe it's just some error on the processing side, or it's maybe not listed in our WEAMS database, which the WEAMS database lists all of the approved programs for those institutions. So we mitigate all of those kind of situations based on the liaison. And contract compliance, as I mentioned. We have to fulfill the VA agreement. That's the bottom line of this. We're doing work for the VA, and it has to be on time, and it has to be on targets. So want to talk a little bit about a case study here, and I want to just mention that this is Minnesota specific. So this is not going to necessarily be in your state. But apprenticeships in Minnesota are all approved through our Minnesota DLI, so Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. So they look at the length of training and make sure that there's prevailing wage scales and that there's training agreements and it's documented and everything is in line. So apprenticeships in Minnesota, as far as our SAA is concerned, are really a great and an easy rubber stamp, if you will, because our MnDOLI has done all the legwork, and they ensure the steps that are taken. We then can approve those apprenticeships. But in your state, if you're not in Minnesota and you want to talk about apprenticeships, this is where we engage with whoever might be overseeing the apprenticeships there. In some states, the apprenticeship approval for the VA side isn't even housed with the SAA. We recently took that over in Minnesota just a number of years ago, where our apprenticeships were also for the SAA, for the work the SAA does on apprenticeships, that was housed at Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. So I recommend you look at that. When we get into OJT programs, there is a difference, of course, between OJTs and apprenticeships. In Minnesota, SAA approves all of the on-the-job training programs. Typically, those have to be 6 months in length and typically are up to 2 years in length for us to approve those particular on-the-job training programs. And again, a lot of what's required in the apprenticeships is the same thing that's required in an OJT. It has to be a prevailing wage scale. It has to lead to certification in that particular position. There has to be some sort of training agreement, documented training plan. All of that has to be in place. Here's where I always like to say kind of cart horse, if you will, on the approval process. In order for us to approve an on-the-job training site, you have to have a veteran in that position who has benefits and wants to use them. So they essentially have to apply, and again, this is the way we do it in Minnesota. Your state might be a little different, but we recommend that those individuals apply for their GI Bill benefits at that work site, and knowing that they'll be denied. That really gives us a trigger, if you will, to go to that work site and look at that training plan, knowing that there's a veteran there who wants to use those benefits. And then we go ahead and approve those benefits, or approve that particular program if it meets all of the VA requirements. So OJTs and apprenticeships, and I didn't get too deep in the flight programs as well, but flight programs are also all approved, and that's even more tricky. That whole process, there's been a little bit of kind of back and forth on the flight programs in different states, including here in Minnesota. So the next area is, let's talk about the National Association of State Approving Agencies. That link that's on the bottom will be their 2017 kind of annual report, and it's out on that particular website. So just so you're kind of tracking on that. And one, I want to make a technical correction too, that a program can be approved without a veteran being in it. It goes for OJT and apprenticeship, just so you're aware, but that programs can be approved without veterans actually being in that program, and I may have alluded to something a little bit different out of that. There are 54 state approving agencies, over 250 professional and support staff, and they're supervising all of these different active facilities with all of those programs. Our central region is for SAA is broken into those states, which really kind of falls into play with also our MCMC, I believe. And I believe Brad's also on the call today, and he's our central region kind of vice president. Right now, the president is Laura Bach, and she's from Washington State. And then for anyone who's listening from Ohio, Dan Wellman, who's your point of contact, he's the immediate past president for the NASA Association. So if you're in Ohio, you'll have strong representation also in your particular state. So their annual report is listed there. I do recommend going out and kind of go from there. So let's see, locations that we have. This is a really busy slide, but points of contact in each of the states is I just pulled this off of one of their websites that you can go out and look. And my next slide has these contacts as well. And I think I may have, my apologies, I may have misspoke. I think I said Dan Wellman is Ohio. He's Illinois. My apologies on that. So again, not to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but our areas and who you should be reaching out to. This is the link to that particular contact list that we talked about. So if you're not on that previous slide, feel free to go out to this. Just put in your state, look for the point of contact. It'll also talk about which agency your state approving agency is housed in. So be it Department of Ed or Veterans Affairs, Workforce Development, or any of those. And also discuss your needs, but keep in mind that these folks are mandated by federal contracts. So the work that they're to perform has to fit with one of those 6 core functions, but we have that liaison that we use here in Minnesota as well that can be a little bit loose in some areas. And they also have a very powerful voice with the VA and the legislators. So again, their recent conference just concluded last week, and I know they have some different ideas and suggestions as they go forward. legislators, and improvements to plans and improvements to how the work is done. But again, we have 54 state approving agencies who maybe have a little bit different vision on getting to the end goal. So sometimes I can understand that can be a little bit tricky as well. But openly convey any intentions. This is the key part of this, because keep in mind that the MCMC goal is to provide bridges and pathways for veterans who are coming out of the military with specific skill sets to get ultimately living wage full-time employment. And typically higher education is that pathway. And if we can provide a gateway for those individuals. And a success story I want to talk about here in Minnesota is Lake Superior College up in Duluth, where they created a bridge program for veterans who, for medics to LPN, and those individuals coming out with those career fields from the military have 1 semester plus a summer semester, and they have their LPN, and all of that was of course mitigated through state approving agency, through the nursing boards, through the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities here in Minnesota. So that curriculum took a while. It was part of a National Governors Association policy committee that I was on with colleagues. Some of you know Gina Sabanya from Minnesota State, and our Jim Finley from our workforce development. So that work was kind of a direct result of that. But again, to get back to this statement, is ensure that your state approving agency, before you create these bridge programs, is aware of what you're doing. Because if you want that program to be eligible for men and women to use a GI Bill, in that state approving agency will need to approve it. And I think with that, I might be a few minutes ahead of schedule here, but I may be finishing up. So I covered a lot of stuff, and I wanted to make sure I fit within my 40 or so minutes, but also had time for some questions. And so I think I'll maybe turn back over to Sarah or one of the other ladies to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Folks have been really good about using the chat feature, the question feature here. And one of the questions that didn't come up, but I know that a lot of folks in MCMC have, is it's data related. And is there any kind of data that the SAA has that they can share with the institutions, so the institutions can compare their numbers with the SAA to make sure they're pretty much in the same ballpark, or do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so that's really kind of tricky, and I know that's always a discussion that we have with kind of within this realm, because each institution, of course, has a certifying official, and they can fairly easily run numbers of certified students, students that they've certified using GI Bill benefits. There is a report that's only numbers that the SAA runs. It's called an RCS report. I don't exactly know what that stands for, but it's an RCS report, and we'll compare numbers that are on the RCS report with numbers that institutions will say that they have certified, and sometimes those numbers aren't even completely correct. So not to get too far into a negative discussion on the data and how that data is there, but and some of that will be kind of within state agencies if you can share. Now, obviously any PII information is really going to be kind of off the table. But as far as numbers are concerned, typically, we can share. I know I'll speak in Minnesota. We'll share those numbers with our institutes of higher learning, with partners, just because it's sheer numbers. We have X amount of students at this institution who are using GI Bill. Our state institutions, they will run reports annually as well for self-identified veterans, and that is driven through financial aid It's also driven by applications, but again, it's self-reported information, so that gets a little bit kind of difficult. But as far as, if you have a good relationship with the state approving agency, and I'm not going to speak for all SAAs, of course, or all states, but typically the data, the numbers usually are not protected with the number of students who are using GI Bill benefits. It just gets tricky once you start, digging down further past that.
Dave, we have another question.
Sure.
Does the annual report compare the number of approved OJT programs by state?
Annual report, is that, I assume that's the annual report from the National Association of State Approving Agencies?
Yes, I believe so.
Compare the number of approved OJT by state. I don't know if it's actually broken down by approved in there or not. That, I apologize, I don't have that report up in front of me. Maybe if whoever asked that particular question could go to, and I want to say my slide is, I think it's number 24 in the deck here. So that one will have the link to the NASA numbers.
Okay, and then is there a general interest in growing the number of OJT programs, or do you feel like the SAA has its hands full?
I'll speak for Minnesota. We're always seeking additional OJT, and I want to say, I don't speak for the association, of course, but I want to say that's one of those initiatives that they really have been talking about is trying to promote the OJT and pushing men and women into those OJT programs or approving those programs so individuals can use their GI Bill. It's a matter of, I think the second part of that question is, yes, hands are full with SAAs because there's so many institutions. The contract requirements are very specific on what they have to do, that this is a little bit outside the box, if you will. Promotion of the programs is important, and growing that is important. But number one, it's meeting those contract goals that the VA has established. So I would say, I know it's a long-winded answer, but I would say yes, that there is an interest in growing those. Businesses need to be, aware of that. It is something that I work on here in Minnesota, is promoting that at career fairs and job fairs. Oh, that's my timer, sorry. My career fairs and job fairs that we have, and that we're able to promote those on a regular basis. But if it falls on the SAA shoulders, again, not to reiterate this fact, but their focus is that contract compliance.
Another question, if you'll bear with me. Why do some states have larger numbers of OJT and some states not? Is it a question of manpower, industry involvement?
It could be that. It could also be that sometimes it's employer-driven as well, where employers understand that to be veteran-friendly, we want to offer these programs. And I want to get to the technical aspect of it as well. There are very specific rules to approve an on-the-job training program. Typically, it has to be 6 months in length, it has to be documented, and not all positions have that. A wage scale and that sort of things, and it has to be documented. So the SAA has to be able to look at what is that training plan, what's encompassed in that training plan, and does it fit with the guidance? If there's employers out there, and I always say the easiest employers to get on board with this is your counties. simply because they have law enforcement. That's a high turnaround area, if you will, for veterans. They also have their road crews and maintenance crews. Again, a lot of veterans go into those career fields. County Veteran Service Officers are typically always veterans. So those areas we look at in Minnesota and say, why are we not, pushing our counties to promote that as well? But and I may not have completely answered. Manpower could very well be as well. Maybe some of the SAA states, like North Dakota, for example, I believe has one SAA person, and that's it. So they have to do all of the contract compliance with all the institutes of higher learning and try to promote OJTs and approve those programs and getting the gist of that. So manpower could very well be the issue. It could also be active states. It could be really active SAAs, and it could be very active employers. But again, I would recommend engaging with the state approving agency and just kind of asking, how do they have a plan to engage employers, or are they doing it already, or can we send employers that are interested in getting approved? Who do we send those to? Again, engaging in your specific SAA is the very first step to see what their operation is.
Thank you, Dave.
This is Sarah. Any other questions? I'm sure that once you have reviewed that report, you might have some or several questions for Dave. And again, his contact information is here on the slide. So thank you for joining us today. I just want to let you know that we've got the future and past MCMC webinars are located there on that link. And our next one is March 14th at 1 o'clock. And it's like Cool Beer Compass, Mapping Military Occupations to Civilian Credentials. And Dave, did you have any final comments?
I appreciate the great participation in this and the questions that were asked. Hopefully, we were able to address some of those, and hopefully this kind of fit what folks were looking for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, this webinar was the result of a lot of questions we had from institutions regarding what is it that SAAs do and how can we partner, collaborate with them. So thank you so much, Dave. We appreciate that. Next up, we just want you to join the conversation. You can look on our Facebook page. And then if you have any specific questions about MCMC or MEC, you may contact me. Again, my name is Sarah Appel, and I'm the manager of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit. So if we have no further questions, we will give you some extra time back to your day. So thank you all very much.